So now we're going to talk about executive function skills. We'll start with the definition and then kind of give you some examples. So executive function skills are a set of processes that have to do with managing oneself and one's resources in order to achieve a goal. And so it's kind of this umbrella term for neurologically based skills involving mental control and self-regulation. So what in the world does that mean, right? We really look at using our executive function skills when we're thinking about processing, planning, what we need, what kind of materials we need. So an example that I like to use to kind of help executive function skills is that for people that are using their executive function skills, between a thought and an action, there should be some space. In other words, we have a thought about doing something, and in that space, we think in pictures and words in our minds. So when we think in pictures and words, we ask ourselves questions oftentimes like, do I have everything I need to do this action? If I don't have everything I need to do this action, can I get it? What are the rules for following this action? What are the things that I need to do? What happened the last time something similar like this was available or happened to me? And what might happen in the future? So it's all these things like problem solving. Do I have everything? Hindsight, foresight. Those are all the things we use with our executive function skills. And when you're not using those, you don't have the space. And that's where we talk about kids being impulsive. They think and they act. And so without that space, kids sometimes make impulsive choices. But here's a really good example of a little guy. He was in second grade, maybe first or second grade, and he's having all these behaviors in the classroom and a lot of behaviors like during transitions, and the teacher was very frustrated and the principal was very frustrated. They said, when I came in, they said, he knows the rules. He just won't follow the rules. We go over the rules. He tells us the rules. We do this check in and check out, and we go over all the rules, but he just won't follow them. And so they were very frustrated that he was like choosing not to follow the rules. So I went to go observe, and I'm watching their whole class, and they're kind of walking in the hallway, and he's out of line and he's touching stuff on the walls and different things. But then they go into the computer lab, and I noticed going from the library into the computer lab was like 2 steps or 3 steps to get into the computer lab. So all the kids are nicely filing into the computer lab, and here's Joey. He's at the top of the stairs, waits a second. What do you think he does? He jumps to the bottom of the stairs. And the teacher stops him and says, Joey, how are we supposed to go into the computer lab? And he's like, we're supposed to walk. And then she looks at me and says, see, he knows the rules. And I was trying to explain to her and the principal that part of it was because he didn't have good executive function skills. Like if you have good executive function skills, you're going to walk to the top of the stairs, and Joey should have said to himself, wow, these stairs look like a lot of fun to jump off of. However, what is the rule for walking into the computer lab? What happens if I don't follow the rule? What happened the last time when I didn't follow the rule? Oh, that's right, I lost my recess. So what choice am I going to make now? There's no space. It's just stairs look like fun, jump. Oh, yeah, there was a rule about that. And so a lot of times our kids don't have these executive function skills, and they look very much like behaviors, but they're a skill deficit. Like if a lot of times my middle school students that are still having trouble with executive function skills, they're not very good at standing at their locker and saying, okay, my next class is world history and algebra. They're nowhere near my locker, so I'll have to be prepared for everything for both classes. These kids show up without even a pencil. And I guarantee you, in most situations, these middle school kids are not standing at their locker saying, you know what, I do not like Mr. Smith, and I will be darned if I bring him a pencil. It's that they're not thinking through those things because they're impulsive, they don't problem solve, and really they don't think in pictures and words. That's part of what we do using our executive function skills, is that we talk to ourselves, we see pictures in our mind, and we use those things to make decisions. So it's also important to understand with the executive function skills that it's a producing difficulty, not a learning difficulty. So I have kids with average to above average IQs. This little guy we just did some evaluation for had 113 IQ, but he still really struggled with executive function skills. So it's not a learning difficulty. It's not an issue of low intelligence. It really is being able to produce. So you can know what you're supposed to do, but doing it in the moment can be problematic for some kids. Now, we also know that the executive function skills are mostly in the frontal lobe. So if you go back to remembering anything about brain development, in any of the classes that you've ever taken, the back part of your brain is the primitive part of the brain that was first developed. And when you're in that part of the brain, you get into the fight, flight, or freeze. It's where you're very reactive. And as we move up into the frontal lobe, that's the highest level of brain functioning, and that's where a lot of these executive function skills are coming from. Now, research shows us that there are other areas of the brain. We know the areas of the brain that have to deal with short-term memory are involved, and so there are other things, but we recognize a lot of the executive function skills come from the frontal lobe. Now, they develop throughout a person's lifetime, specifically into the second decade of life. And so I always tell people, okay, remember when you maybe were in college or in your 20s and you can think back to something dumb that you did. It's okay, your executive functions were still developing at that time, and you may not do those things now. But it also wires and routes how we think and function. And we oftentimes see that it impacts things like reading and writing. So how many of our kids, writing is a trigger for them? We see that sometimes because of those executive function skill deficits. And those are those academic areas that can be problematic. And again, it's not being able to learn the skill, but demonstrating the skill. So for some of, like my own son, I'll be giving some examples of him as well, because he has a lot of trouble with executive function skills. And so again, he knows what he's supposed to do. He's had situations where he's taken classes or been in counseling or social skills or some of those kinds of things. He knows what he's supposed to do. It's just an issue of demonstrating it in the moment. And they can oftentimes result in some explosive behavior. So the executive function skills are developed by working memory, visual working memory, verbal working memory, emotional regulation, and problem solving. And all of those things kind of go together to help develop this area of executive functions. And some of it comes from the work of Dr. Russell Barkley. He's written a lot on kids with ADHD, and you will often see some of these same characteristics in kids with ADHD. So some of the executive functions I'm going to be going over, there's 8 of them primarily. Some literature uses 9, some 7. There's about 8 executive function skills that all kind of go together. And what I want to do is give you an example of what that executive function skill looks like and how you can maybe see where that might look like a behavior, but again is actually a skill deficit. And then some of the examples of different things that you can do in order to help with those executive function skills. So the first one has to do with inhibit, and inhibit is the ability to stop one's own behavior. So this is on here you'll see like the class clown is kind of the stereotype, because these kids act wilder in groups than others. They don't stop laughing when other kids stop laughing. They're silly. They make noises and hum and tap. They easily interrupt others. Sometimes they don't think before acting. So this is the ability to inhibit or stop one's own behavior. But a really good example of how I saw this with my son when he was just 6 or 7 years old. So at the time, we lived in a subdivision on a cul-de-sac, and we were friends with a lot of the neighbors who all had kids about the same age. They all went to the same school. And so when the weather got nice, we would always sit outside on someone's driveway, and the adults would sit and hang out and talk. And since we were on a cul-de-sac, we could just kind of watch the kids, and they could play kickball or ride their bikes or that kind of thing. Of this group of neighbors, most of them were boys. It was just a bunch of 6 and 7-year-old boys, or a couple girls, but it just happened to be this group of friends that we had where there were a lot of boys. So if you stop for a minute and think, like, how do boys that are 6 or 7 years old play? They play rough, right? They wrestle, they make sticks into machine guns, they roll down hills. They're just kind of rough when it comes to how they play. Well, I would always sit in the driveway with that feeling in the pit of my stomach, waiting for it to happen, because my son, who has some difficulty with executive function skills, it would always happen. And sure enough, he'd come and somebody had pushed him down. He had pushed somebody down. And so what I was trying to help people understand, because I kind of knew it intuitively, but I didn't know enough about executive function skills to be able to explain it, is that what would happen is he was playing with these kids, and they would be rough and moving and jumping and wrestling, and then my son would take it one step too far and push somebody down. Well, that's very different than a kid saying, "I don't like you," and pushing him down. But that's how the parents saw it. The parents saw it like my kid was being the bully. My kid was the one that was pushing, and it was really more of a, when I'm in this unstructured environment and we're running around and playing, he took it one step too far. And so we'll oftentimes see kids with executive function skill deficits having trouble during recess and PE and some of those kinds of classes, because that becomes very difficult for them in order to kind of control and inhibit that behavior. Now, another example, this was a couple years ago. My son is now 20, but this was when he was 18, and he went to this summer horseback riding camp kind of thing that he did over the summer, and he loved it. He loves animals. It was something where they went every day for 4 days a week over the summer, and they did all kinds of things where they put the horses in shows, and he had to learn. My son loves animals, so I always think that that's probably why he liked it, but maybe also because all of the other people in the camp were girls. But at any rate, he really did like this camp. Towards the end of the summer, the lady that was running the camp and doing the lessons, she said, "Amy, can you come in and talk to me about something?" And I was like, "Sure, no problem." So I walk in, and I could tell she was kind of frustrated. So I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And she just looked at me and she says, "Well, we have to do something about all this texting." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I didn't know what she was talking about. I mean, my son, like I said, he's 20. He has executive function skill deficits. He has bipolar. But to just see him, he looks like any other kid. He has a phone. He uses his phone. He texts me or his friends or whatever. And so I was like, "Oh, what's going on with his phone?" I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Well, last week he texted me at 5:30 in the morning, and I still want to be sleeping at 5:30 in the morning. And over the weekend he texted me on Sunday, which is my time to go to church with my family." And here I'm thinking, okay, this is my son, right? He doesn't have good executive function skills, so he has no space. So he happens to be up at 5:30 in the morning, and he has a thought: when is the next horse show? And then he has an action: I'll text the person that has the answer. He doesn't have the space to be able to say, okay, wait a minute, it's 5:30 in the morning. Most people are still sleeping at 5:30 in the morning. I should wait and ask later. It's a thought and an action. I think about when's the next horse show, I ask the person. And so when he realized that he did this and she was upset with him, he felt terrible because he was not trying to be disrespectful. Although that's how she looked at it. This 18-year-old is not respecting my time, and he's being selfish, and he only cares about himself. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, this is his executive function skill, because he learned from it. Like the whole way home, he was like, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that." And now he's better at it. Like he learned that skill to be able to wait and text people or ask questions or contact people at appropriate times. But that was something that he needed to learn and just wasn't thinking. It was hard because she was so frustrated. She was so frustrated that this 18-year-old is being disrespectful. And I felt like, gosh, I wish I could help more people understand executive function skill deficits, because this is just a way that his brain works differently, not that he's trying to be disrespectful. But again, some very good examples of how that works to demonstrate when kids or adults even have trouble inhibiting, saying things without thinking, and those kinds of things. So some strategies that we would use for inhibiting have to do with sometimes teaching verbal self-talk. There are ways in some of the curriculums where you can actually teach kids to picture things in their mind and talk to themselves in their mind. We want to review the expectations and rules often, so kind of preempt it like we talked about in those preventative strategies. So being able to, ahead of time saying, okay, let's review the rules. How do we walk into the computer lab? That's right, we walk, and kind of giving them that prompt ahead of time. Sometimes nonverbal signals can help. Especially again, if you have kids that blurt out, maybe giving them some kind of nonverbal signal to remember to raise their hand and those kinds of things. Any type of role play can be helpful for kids to be able to role play how to respond in certain situations, and any kind of visual supports that we can do. I've had different situations with the role play. There was a game that we played. It was based on some things that Ron Leaf has talked about in training on social skills. But this was a high school student. He didn't have very good executive function skills. He was very impulsive, would say things without thinking, not always responding appropriately. And we played this game called Cool versus Not Cool. And so we had all these little cards, like in a hat kind of thing. And we would play, the teachers as well as the student. We'd pull out this card and you would read something and it said you just won a soccer game. So then whoever picked that card had to act that out in a way that was cool or not cool, and then the student or the rest of the group had to decide whether it was cool or not cool. So like I'm using that example because I had that one when I was playing the game with them, and so I went over and I said, woohoo, I won, you're a loser, loser, loser. And he would say, no, that's not cool, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that. I said, that's right, Joey. Why don't you show me how to do it the cool way? And so then we're role playing, but we're making it fun. I'm like, when you win a game, how do you congratulate the people that lost and practice that? So it made a kind of a fun way of practicing some of these skills in a way that was very helpful. And he loved the game. It was really fun. Okay, a second executive function skill has to do with shifting. And being able to shift is to move freely as a circumstance changes or demands from one thing to another. So these are our kids that we think are kind of hard-headed. They're very, they only look at things in one way, but they have a difficult time shifting. So oftentimes the shifting is very difficult between a preferred and a non-preferred. So I think I've mentioned this before in some of the other videos, kids that finally get on the computer, but then they have to stop the computer to go do something else. And sometimes stopping the computer means you go back to work. So when we have kids that have behavior because they are not able to shift from a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity. Some kids have so much trouble with this that even shifting from a preferred to another preferred can be difficult. I had a parent one time, she's like, I don't get it. We were on our way to go bowling. It was like this place called Brunswick Zone, and you can bowl and you can do laser tag and all these different kinds of things. It was really great. The kids were excited and they were all in the car on the way to go bowling. And mom said, oh, I forgot, I have some coupons for a free ice cream cone. We're going to stop and go through McDonald's. And so, and then he has a meltdown. He's like, we were going bowling. And mom's like, I don't get it. I was going to go give him an ice cream. But for some kids, once they get kind of in that groove that this is what's supposed to happen, shifting and looking at another way can be very difficult. And we see this a lot with our kids with autism and Asperger's syndrome too, that don't like change. They like for things to stay the same. Now, we might have kids that do the same things repeatedly, cannot get disappointment off their mind. They resist alternatives to solve problems, become upset in new situations. Sometimes they try the same approach over and over. They don't like changes in plans and not creative in their problem solving. Now, as far as strategies go, one of the things that I realized, I was recognizing this with my son, and he, like I said, he's 20 now, but this was probably when he was like 10. And at the time, when he was 10 years old, he absolutely loved to be on electronics. Like he would have done some kind of video game or electronic game 24 hours a day. He was very into that at the time. Luckily, he's not anymore. But because he wanted to be on a computer game all the time, we were always having to turn it off because it was time to turn it off because it was time to go to bed or time to go to school or time for dinner, or because it was a Saturday and you've already been playing it for an hour and I need you to take a break from it. But the problem was that every time he transitioned off of it, he was having behavior. I mean, he was never, my son has never been aggressive, but he has had some property destruction where he bangs on things or throws something, he gets mad easily. But we have gone through all those things, but that's the kind of stuff he would do. He would yell, he would maybe pound on the computer keys, he'd kind of push it away. He's getting mad over having to turn the computer off. So with my experience in working with kids with autism, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to get a timer. And then maybe if I give him a timer and say, okay, you've got 5 more minutes, maybe that'll help prepare him to transition. That didn't work. He was still having trouble. And I remember this time, he's refusing. I want to be consistent. So I turned the monitor off. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. That didn't go very well. But as I was kind of, again, reading about all of these things and trying to figure out more about executive function skills so I could help kids, I realized that most of the time when you're talking about a video game or something on the computer or some type of an electronic, that those things are very goal-oriented. In other words, kids are trying to reach a goal. They're trying to get to a certain level, or a knight is trying to defeat a dragon. And so what happens is that sometimes when we're asking kids to shift or transition, we're actually asking them to do that in the middle of something. And even we as adults don't do that very well. We learn a strategy pretty early that involves us learning how to get to a stopping point. So let me give you an example. let's say you've got your online banking up and you're looking over the last 2-3 months how much gas you've spent. You want to kind of checking on your budget and that kind of stuff. So you take a piece of paper and you've written down all of these numbers from your online banking on the amount of gas that you've spent. And so you get your calculator app out and you're getting to the point where you're kind of you're starting to add them up. And so you add up the first 3 and your mom, dad, spouse, kid, somebody comes in and says, "Hey mom, can you help me with something?" Are you going to shift right there? Probably not. You're probably going to say, "Just a minute," and you're going to add up all the numbers, you're going to write down the answer, and then you're going to shift. So I realized with my son and even with some of the kids that I was working with, I was having him shift in the middle of trying to get to a certain level, and that was very difficult for him. So I changed it a little bit. I still used a timer, only a couple times though. I could just kind of tell him, what time we needed to transition. But I made sure I gave us plenty of time. Like if we had to be somewhere at 10, I'm probably starting this process at 9:15. And I would say, okay, at 9:30, you need to get to a stopping point. Now that might have taken another 10 minutes, but I was letting him get to that natural stopping point. Now, what do you think I needed to do in the very beginning? I had to sit with them because when he got to a stopping point, he wanted to start another one. But when I was able to then teach him that this is the time that you need to be finished, but I will let you get to a stopping point, he made those transitions with no problem. It wasn't an issue of, I just don't like what mom's telling me, although that might have been some of the issue. But some of it was this inability to shift. I have this little guy and he's doing our Rage to Reason program and he does the iPad for his reinforcers. He had a really hard time transitioning off the iPad, but we've worked through that as part of the program. But I remember I was in the classroom, he'd been doing this for like 6 weeks and he's doing that game Temple Run. So he's on the iPad and he's pushing the little guy and trying to get the coins or whatever they do, and his timer goes off and he's like kind of in this panicked like, "Mrs. Bowie, I get to a stopping point." I'm like, "Yes, Joey, every time you get to a stopping point." So he goes and he goes and then his little character dies, like, "Okay," and he sets it down and he's ready to work. If I had said, "Oh no, the timer goes off, you need to stop right now," before he got to that stopping point, I guarantee we would have had more problem behavior. By giving him that little bit of a skill there to wait till he gets to a stopping point, he transitioned fine and got right back to work. So giving 2-minute warnings before changing, using a timer, getting to that stopping point, clear schedules of daily activities, so being able to predict for kids like when things are going to happen to make those transitions, modeling again, and some of the problem-solving maps and different visual maps that we can do can all be helpful in this area. Okay, the third one has to do with emotional control, and this is the ability to regulate emotions. So the stereotype are these kids that are the king and queen of meltdowns. Some of the things that we see is they overreact to small problems. They're very moody, have explosive, angry outbursts. Their mood changes frequently and they react more strongly than others, or even the opposite, can become over silly and overly excited. So we see this with our kids with this emotional control. And what I oftentimes see for kids is that a minor thing is a big deal. So I had this little guy, again, I'll say his name is Joey. He gets off the bus, he's walking to class. Tommy, his friend, gets off the bus behind him, but walks faster than him and gets into the classroom. So Joey's like, "This is not fair. He got into the classroom first. It was my turn to go in first." And he's mad and upset because he wanted to go into the classroom first. And so, I always tell people, like, these are the kind of things that we deal with sometimes with our kids. Like, is it really that big a deal that somebody walked into the classroom first? Yes, for some of these kids, a little thing is a big deal. I don't know how many times I do consultations where someone says the issue is because someone can't be line leader every day. We have to work through some of these things. And another example, when my son was young, people, I think, would look at it as he had problem behavior because he wasn't getting his way. But sometimes it was just these little things that would frustrate him, and I had no idea when it was going to happen. So my 2 boys at the time were old enough to come. My daughter was still baby, but they were able to come down and getting ready for school and sit down and have breakfast. And so they were getting dressed, and I had the table set already. Basically, I had a blue bowl in one spot and a red bowl in another spot so that they could have cereal. So again, my son with executive function skill deficits, his spot has the blue bowl, and he comes down and sees it, and then he's already in a meltdown. "I wanted the red bowl." Those little kinds of things where a tiny thing becomes a big deal, oftentimes we see within this area. So interventions, teaching kids to identify the triggers and self-control strategies. So we're going to give a lot of recommendations when we get into visual supports and teaching coping skills. Sometimes for a kid to be able to journal, to be able to just kind of write down how they're feeling. Also moving to a safe environment and providing an escape system. So like having kids be able to say, I need a break and I need to go to the counselor's office or to the principal's office. So instead of like waiting till problem behavior happens and then sending them out, having them have a way to communicate that says, I need to go and take a break right now. I was in a building one time and they had like one of those timeout rooms. We never really used it for that. But I wanted to basically teach the student, like if you ever get overwhelmed in class, you can just raise your hand, touch this card, tell me I need a break, and you can go there and have a break. And he wasn't in trouble. It was a way for him to say that he was able to, need that break appropriately. I was just doing a consultation on the phone yesterday and they said he keeps running to the gym and we're afraid that he's going to run away. I was like, does he go to the gym every time? Yeah, he goes to the gym and he's mad and he throws balls. I'm like, well, then give him a way to ask for that, because I think that right now, based on some things going on, he needs that strategy. So give them a place to escape that's okay, where they're not in trouble. Also things like, stress balls, using empathy and problem solving, instructions and social skills, all of those things help in this area. Another one has to do with initiate. So this is to begin a task or generate an idea. And the stereotype here is these kids, someone says, oh, these kids are so lazy because they don't get started on things. However, that may very well be an executive function skill deficit. So these are kids that you say, okay, we're going to write in your journal. They're like, I don't know what to write about. They have no idea what they're supposed to write about because they can't generate the idea, not necessarily because there's just nothing that they can think about. Like, I'll get this a lot with teachers. Well, they'll say, well, yesterday they were able to figure out what they were writing about, so today they're just refusing. One of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is that executive function skills do not work as well when people are stressed or anxious. And so we kind of talk about that. Remember, the frontal lobe is part of where the executive function skills occur. We talk about the fact that anxiety hijacks the frontal lobe. Everybody is a little more impulsive and have a little bit more difficult time processing, problem solving, all of those things when they're stressed. So you may have a student that, yes, 2 days ago had no problem writing in their journal, but today says, I don't know what to write about. What just happened at recess before they came in? Maybe they're very dysregulated and they're not, comprehending as well what's going on because their executive function skills are not working as well. So again, I don't know what to write about. Sometimes they don't know what to write about, even if they've demonstrated it before. So they're not a self-starter, sometimes prompted to begin a task, trouble with ideas for free time, not taking initiative, those kinds of things we can see with a number of kids. Now, the other piece that I see is that getting started on something. I had a family I was working with and I said, well, how's it going? What's going on at home? And they're like, our biggest fight, this was a middle school student, is she doesn't want to take a shower. I said, okay, that's, she's like, we fight this every night. And she's like, actually, we started doing a shower every other night. So we had a break from the power struggle, at least one every other night. I said, okay, so it's time for her shower. And she refuses and she doesn't want to go. And the parents are like, the weird thing is, though, is that once we finally get her into the shower, she takes like this 25-minute shower, uses all the water, is happy and can be playing in the shower, singing. She doesn't seem to dislike the shower. It's just getting her in. Well, that can be an executive function skill of not being able to initiate or get started on something. So I like to give this example to help you kind of understand what it feels like when you have a hard time initiating. So let's say you had a really rough day, whatever happened, whether you're teaching or in a school, a parent, whatever, you had this really rough day and you're tired. Like there was all kinds of stuff going on after work, after school, your kids, you had to run everywhere, had dinner late, and you're just kind of like, boy, I am ready to be finished for the night. So you put on your comfy clothes and it's about 10:15. You sit down on the couch, you grab the remote or maybe your phone to look at Facebook or something. You're basically kind of, you got a blanket over your feet. You're ready to like chill out and kind of be ready to start winding down to go to bed. So it's now 10:30, you're all comfy on the couch, and you have this thought and you think, oh, I really need to do a load of laundry. So I always ask people, like, how difficult would it be to initiate and get up and do a load of laundry in that moment? Like, most people think to themselves, okay, do I have enough underwear to get through one more day, right? Because that's really hard to initiate at that time. And so I try to give that example that for a lot of the things, especially the less preferred they are, that's what that feels like for kids with executive function skill deficit. So a lot of the things that we're asking them to do is very difficult for them to initiate. Now, some interventions is to establish some routines. Again, using a timer can be helpful, like letting them know that you have this much time to get ready to transition. Peer partners can sometimes be helpful to kind of prompt some of those things. Sometimes what we call warm-up activities can be helpful. So I had this little guy, and he did not like math, especially as the math continued to get more difficult. He was in 3rd grade. They were starting multiplication. He was getting a little frustrated. It's hard to kind of learn to remember all those facts and everything. And so he would sometimes have these refusals but like, if you ever have a kid that's refusing, but once they get started on something, they're fine, that's an initiation executive function skill deficit, not a refusal. And that's kind of how he was. Once he got started, he was fine. So we did this warm-up activity. The teacher, I think math was like right before lunch, and the kids had already been sitting at their desks for 20 minutes or whatever doing science. So now it's time for math. She has all the kids get up and get in a circle in the kind of circle the classroom. She grabs a Nerf ball, and all the kids knew that they were supposed to do a 1-digit by 1-digit addition problem. So the teacher would start and she'd say 2 + 2 is, and then she'd throw it to somebody, and whoever caught it had to say 4, and then they got to ask a problem. Well, obviously, all of these 3rd graders knew 1-digit by 1-digit addition problems. It was easy. No one had to be put on the spot that they were going to get it wrong. But what are they doing? They're up, they're moving, they're playing with the ball, and we're doing some math. So it's kind of like this warm-up activity. Okay, I'm already doing math. Sometimes I can help to sit down and initiate getting started with the math. And then frequent reinforcement and even shortened tasks can help as well. Okay, another one has to do with working memory, and this is holding information in mind for your tasks. So this is like thinking and in pictures and holding that information on your short-term memory. So these are the kind of kids that we say, how many times do I have to tell you? You're having to tell them over and over because they're not holding on to that short-term memory. They're absent-minded. They oftentimes have difficulty with multi-steps, maybe forget what he was doing, having that short attention span, trouble completing tasks and very distracted, remembers only the first and the last thing to do. So that's where we see kids that don't have good working memory. One of the things that I did, my son was probably 12 maybe, and he's the oldest of our 3 kids. And so it occurred to me, my husband's family lives about 3 hours away. So anytime we go visit, we're probably going to stay for the whole weekend. And my son being 12, let's see, my middle son would have been 11, 10 and a half, 11, and then my daughter 9 or whatever. And I realized, like my other 2 kids, I could say, hey, we're going to grandma and granddad's this weekend, go pack a bag. And they would actually be able to have the things that they needed most of the time. Like by that age, they were able to pack a bag. And I didn't even think about it. Like that's kind of a complex skill if you don't have good executive function skills. So what I wanted to do for my son, because he's the oldest and I'm thinking I still have to pack his bag, he needs to learn this, is I wanted to give him the picture that you should have in your mind with some of the key components that you need to pack a bag. So I took a piece of paper. Up in the right-hand corner, I drew a box, and then I put a line on the top and then kind of wrote down common things, kind of like a checklist of the things that you would pack in your bag, shirts and pants and socks and all of those things. And I gave it to him and I said, there's a couple of things you need to know before you start packing a bag. One, I put a number up in the box, which is the number of days you're going to be gone. People on extended weekends, you're standing there packing and you say Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, because you want to make sure you have enough of everything when you pack. The other thing that goes on the line is the weather, especially in the spring and the fall. It's going to depend on whether or not it's going to be cool in the morning, warmer in the afternoon. Is it summertime? Do you want a swimsuit? Will we be there on a Sunday? We need church clothes. All of those different kinds of things we need to think about. And so I gave that to him. I only needed to give it to him a couple times so he could have what I see in my mind, which is the pictures and words of what I need on my working memory, my short-term memory, in order to pack a bag. Last summer we went on vacation. The first thing he says to me, how many days are we going to be gone? So he was able to learn that skill. So these things can be taught It's just that they oftentimes need some very specific strategies. So interventions, repeating and rephrasing instructions, providing visuals. Anytime you can make something visual, like I did with my checklist, just tell somebody, go get your shoes and your backpack and don't forget a snack. Like, those are 3 things to do that when you say it, then it's gone. But if you have those things written down, it becomes a permanent product. Graphic organizers, checklist, and chunking can all be very helpful strategies. Another one has to do with self-regulation, and this is behaviors where kids recognize how their behavior affects others. Like, there's a lot of kids by the time they're in, 2nd, 3rd grade, if they don't like what their teacher tells them, they're not going to drop to the ground and start kicking their feet and crying, because they know their friends would look at them like, what are you doing? That's weird, right? They get the social piece of that, and sometimes our kids miss that social piece and they don't recognize how their behavior affects others. So another story kind of extends from the one that I talked about in an earlier video. This was my friend Tim, who wanted to get rid of his para. Remember, he's like looking at the tickets to spend, his tokens to spend, how many do I have to spend, and then he looks at me and says, hey, Mrs. Bowie, how many of these tickets does it take to get rid of her? And he wanted to get rid of his para. Same kid, loved this kid, he was hilarious. Well, he starts this new behavior right around the end of 5th grade, and that's this. He started to put his hands in his armpits and smelling his fingers, and all the kids were like, gross, Mrs. Bowie, Tim is smelling his armpits. I was like, oh gosh, okay. So I have Tim come into my classroom. It was just the 2 of us. I knew that this probably wasn't going to be a lesson that he was going to get at home, so I bought some deodorant, and I'm sitting down with him. I'm like, this happens, your body starts to change, you need to use some deodorant. And he's like, not buying it, right? He's like, how do I know that stuff will work? I was like, well, if a product's been around for a while and people are still buying it, it's probably something that works. I'm trying to rationalize why he should use this deodorant, and he's still giving me trouble about it. I don't know, that's weird. I don't want to put that in my armpits. I don't know if that's going to work. And so finally I get to the point, I'm like, look, Tim, I want you to try it. Just try it, because I'm pretty confident it's going to work. He's like, but how will I know? I said, here's the deal. You try the deodorant. If you are concerned about whether it's working or not, you can go in the bathroom and check a couple times a day. And he stopped and he thought for a minute. He's like, Mrs. Bowie, do you smell your armpits every time you go into the bathroom? I said, no, Tim, I don't, because my deodorant works. But it's a good point, because if I was concerned whether or not my deodorant was working, I would do that in the bathroom, not in the middle of social studies. I said, Tim, this is the reason the kids don't want to sit by you at lunch. He's like, really? So not recognizing how his behavior was affecting others. Sometimes with this self-monitoring, kids don't check work for mistakes. They can make careless errors, leaves work incomplete, and needs lots of prompting. So some of the strategies is identify the time needed for a task before beginning and build in stop checkpoints. So, instead of just saying, here's the assignment and wait until it's supposed to be finished, like some stop checkpoints can be helpful. Students can set a goal, give very concrete instructions. The other thing you can do to help monitor is like a voice control monitor. I had one of my students with Asperger's syndrome, and he was in the regular ed classroom with a para, and he would start talking when the teacher was lecturing. So the teacher's lecturing, Joey's talking, then the para's saying, Joey, you can't talk. So guess what? Now all 3 of them are talking, and it was disruptive. So I was able to just make a visual that basically was like, I took a piece of paper and folded it into thirds, so it made a little tent. So one side said no talking, you flipped it over, it said quiet voice, you flipped it over, it says medium voice. So then that way, if he was talking, the parent could just put on the voice monitor what he should be doing at the time. Quiet voice because kids are working in groups, medium voice because it's indoor recess, or you can't talk at all because the teacher is talking right now. And so that helped, and it helped because we could do that non-verbally. So it wasn't a bunch of people talking, trying to get him to stop talking, but just making those visuals can be very helpful. Another one is to plan and organize, and this is the ability to manage task demands. So these are kids that have a difficult time like managing what all needs to be done in a certain period of time. Because as kids get older, they will eventually get an assignment on a Monday, such as a book report, that's not due for 2 weeks. So how much needs to be completed and finished in order to be ready to turn the project in in 2 weeks. Or even with high school kids and middle school kids, they're doing more and more long-term projects. If our kids that don't have good executive function skills and can't plan and organize, these are the ones that wait till the very last minute. Now, don't get me wrong, we all do that some, but for some of our kids, it's too overwhelming. Like, I don't know what I need. I don't know how much needs to be completed. I don't know what materials. I can't problem solve. They test poorly despite knowing the answer. They have good ideas, but can't get the job done. Their written work is poorly organized. They start projects without the right materials. It's again where they show up with nothing. Trouble planning, underestimate the time that it's needed. Now, another story here I'll kind of tell on myself. When my daughter was in fifth grade, right before middle school. So fifth grade, she had to do this science fair project as part of her grade. Like everybody's second semester grade a lot of it was this science fair project. But there wasn't a lot of guidance. Like the teacher sent home this paper that basically had 50 different ideas. We were supposed to pick one, and we maybe got that in February, and the thing was due at the end of April. And that was it. So I know I'm a teacher, I should know better, but we did way too much of that science fair project the weekend before. It was due on a Monday, and I kept thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I cannot believe, we didn't do all of it that weekend, but too much of it. We waited too long and put it off, and I was just sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I'm an educator and I'm giving this message to my daughter that we're doing this at the last minute. But it was funny because on Sunday, my husband came home from Walmart and he said, I was not the only dad in that aisle buying stuff for the science fair project that all the parents are doing for Monday. But the point is that I wanted to make sure that I did that different next time. And it was great when she went to middle school. She had this awesome science teacher. He was just amazing, great teacher. And they also had to do a science project to learn the scientific process. Only instead of assigning something that wasn't due for 8 weeks, the kids had to do a certain part of the project and it was due every Friday for points. So for example, they had to write up the hypothesis and it was due on Friday for 5 points. I felt like that was such a great way to teach all these middle school kids, who probably all are still learning executive function skills, how to plan and problem solve. This is how much you should have done by this time, and working on that a little bit at a time. It was very helpful for my daughter. It was helpful for us. I'm sure it was helpful for every single student. So having those kinds of strategies, especially with executive function skill difficulties, can be very helpful. So other planning and organizing strategies, verbalizing the plan before starting, using timelines. So you can say by this date, this much needs to be finished. The self-monitoring, sometimes using a planner can be helpful. And again, peer support has shown in research that these things are very helpful for kids as well. And then another one is organizing materials, and this is known as collecting and storing. So these are kids that they leave the areas a mess. They lose their lunch money, their glasses, their homework. They can't find their clothes, their shoes are missing, backpacks are disorganized, desks are disorganized. They forget to hand in homework. I think that that's something that we really see with a lot of the disorganization in this area with kids. So I had this one teacher and she's like, man, this kid's driving me crazy. He's so unorganized. And she showed me his desk and it was just packed with stuff. And she pulls out this paper and she's like, see, this was due 2 days ago. He said he lost it. He can't keep track of anything. He's driving me crazy. So I told the teacher, I'm like, maybe you need to kind of teach him organization. That doesn't come naturally to everybody. Some people don't have that skill. And so about a week later, I went and I said, how's that kid doing that was driving you crazy? And she's like, oh, I think I fixed it. She's like, I gave him a second desk. I think he needed more room. Well, sure enough, the second desk was packed and filled with all kinds of papers. And so that wasn't necessarily the best strategy. The idea is what we really want to do is teach them how to be organized, whether that's putting some kind of a binder system together where everything's in the binder. I know some kids don't do well to have a green notebook and a green folder for science and a red notebook and a red folder for social studies. It's too much. It all has to be concise. And you have to teach kids, just handing out the papers, who knows what's going to happen to them. Can you hand the paper and then say, okay, where does this go? Follow through with it. Help to reinforce when they use the correct behavior. These are all very good things to do with kids to help with that organization. So some interventions, again, checklists, the organizational binder system, sometimes color coding can be helpful in organizing for some kids. Sometimes giving a structured time to organize, so being able to say, okay, right now we're going to work on cleaning out our desks or our locker. Sometimes the expandable file, or even the use of backup items. I remember my son had trouble in one of the schools that he went to with a little bit of bullying, and he got pushed into a locker, and he was also still struggling with all these executive function skills as a middle school student. And we were in an IEP meeting, and the teacher said, well, he doesn't ever remember his materials, and so I'm going to start taking 2 points off every time he comes without his materials. Luckily, I was good friends with the special ed director because I had worked in that school district, and she said, I really think he's probably more worried about not getting pushed into a locker than remembering a pencil. So how about we just have some backup items? So I was very glad that she supported that. But granted, no one writes checks anymore, but let's just use an example. You're at the grocery store and you can't find a pen to write a check. They're not going to say, I'm sorry, you have to go put your groceries back since you forgot your pen. We have to be accommodating to kids that are struggling with these things because they're not necessarily doing them intentionally. So a couple of examples and things to kind of end when we talk about executive function skills. There's a resource list on the website that gives all the different kinds of books that we recommend, especially some on executive function skills. There's some work by Peg Dawson and Richard Garr, and they have some really, really good stuff on teaching executive function skills. But I think it's really important to understand that these things need to be taught, and it's important that it's part of the curriculum. So there was a study many years ago. I always refer to it as the marshmallow study. There was probably a different name for it out of Stanford, but they worked with these 3-year-olds, and basically the 3-year-olds were given a marshmallow and told if they could wait for 5 minutes, they could have a second marshmallow, which would be better, right? If I can wait, I can have 2 marshmallows. So they're already testing whether or not kids can inhibit. And there's some videos from this study. It was cute, these little 3-year-olds like covering their eyes and sitting on their hands and doing everything that they could possibly do to try and not eat the marshmallow so that they could have the second one. The data showed that of these 3-year-olds, about a third of them could wait. They already had the skill to be able to inhibit. Now they follow these kids through adults, and what was interesting is that group, that 1/3 of children that could already inhibit at age 3, they had significantly higher ACT and SAT scores, college graduates, socioeconomic status, all kinds of things were much higher. So we always tell people, does that mean that a third of the kids are lucky and they're going to be successful and the other are not? No, what it means is that these kids need to be taught these skills. A couple other examples. I was in a training where they were talking about executive function skills, and there was the lady was talking about a guy that she was, I guess, knew or was talking to who was in college. And she was talking to him, and he's like, I'm flunking out of college. And she's like, really? What's going on? And he's like, it's very frustrating because I graduated with A's and B's in high school. And he said, I have ADHD. I had a 504 plan, which is a plan that helps with modifications for kids with medical issues like ADHD. And people modified and accommodated and made things to where I was very successful. I mean, A's and B's, I did great. He's like, but my problem is why didn't anybody teach me these executive function skills? Like, no one taught me these things, so I can't get a project done, I can't plan, I can't problem solve, and I'm flunking out of college, even though I had great grades, because no one taught me these skills. And I think it's a good point to show that it's very important that these skills are taught. So this is my last little analogy to help you understand how do we put these kinds of strategies in place. So for years, probably 15 years or more, I have been traveling all over the state of Missouri doing consultations in these little bitty towns. Some of them I had never heard of before, but 10, 15 years ago when I was doing consultations, in order to get to whatever town I was going to, I had to use MapQuest, right? I used MapQuest, and so I printed directions. I had them sitting next to me in the car. I had to pay attention to what was going on because I had to, in 7 miles, I'm going to have to make a right turn. So I'm very cognizant of what's going on using the MapQuest. Now, a lot of cars, mine included, has a navigation system. And so I can just put my address in and blindly go. Helen, which is what we call our navigator, just takes me where I need to go. It drives my husband crazy. He's like, you don't even know where you're going. I'm like, well, I kind of know where I'm going, but she'll tell me how to get there. So in other words, I don't have to think as hard when I have a navigation system. So the analogy here is that when you're working with kids with executive function skills, you need to be their MapQuest, not their navigation system. In other words, we want to provide the supports that they need to be successful. If they feel like a failure, they will feel, if they don't have the strategies that they need, they will associate school with failure. But you don't want to give them so much support and so many things that they don't learn how to do it, that they become prompt dependent, that they only know how to do these things with the strategies in place. So it's kind of this balance. It's this balance of making sure we support them, but also teaching them the skills at the same time. And that's going to be a very important component. So a lot of what we do in the school setting and in the Rage to Reason program and in some of the consultation is really including how can we teach those executive function skills so that we can help kids make the progress that they need. Don't forget, I'm talking about kids with executive function skills, but everybody, you included, your executive function skills don't work very well under stress and anxiety. So there's a lot of kids who at times could be experiencing deficits in this area. So we really want to be able to support kids to be successful.